You wake up hearing voices, not metaphorically, actually hearing them clear and specific, right there in the dark. Maybe they're warning you about something. Maybe they're telling you things nobody else can know. Maybe it's 3 in the morning and everyone around you is asleep and the voices are just there, insistent, like they've always been there and you're only now paying attention. Now put yourself in ancient Egypt, 3,000 years ago. No diagnosis, no medication, no clinical language to describe what's happening to you. Just the voices and the people around you watching and the question of what happens next. Here's what most people assume. It was bad. That ancient societies lacking any real understanding of the mind would have responded to mental illness with fear, cruelty, or at best, confused pity. That the history of mental illness is basically a long, grim slog from superstition to science, from chains to therapy, from darkness to the relative light of right now. And look, that's not entirely wrong. Parts of that story are exactly as dark as you'd expect, but parts of it are genuinely stranger. Stranger in ways that are sometimes better than you'd think, sometimes worse, and occasionally so bizarre that the only reasonable response is to sit with it for a second and say, actually, wait. Because here's the thing about the history of mental illness. It doesn't run in a straight line from primitive to enlightened. It loops. It contradicts itself. A civilization that understood something crucial about the mind gets replaced by one that forgot it entirely. A treatment that sounds barbaric turns out to have a survival rate. A system designed to protect the vulnerable becomes a machine for exploiting them. The oldest physical evidence we have, skulls, actual human skulls, suggests that our ancestors were performing brain surgery on people somewhere around 7,000 years ago. And some of those people lived. Someone kept them alive afterward. That either says something profound about ancient compassion, or it says something deeply strange about ancient problem solving. Possibly both. Those skulls, by the way, are not rare. That's the part that gets me. Across France alone, researchers have found at least 100 trypan skulls. That's the technical term, trepanation, from the Greek word for to bore through. And they're not clustered in one place or one era. They show up in Neolithic Europe, in pre-Columbian South America, in ancient China, in sub-Saharan Africa. Someone, independently, on basically every inhabited continent, looked at a person behaving strangely and thought, the problem is probably in the skull. Let's address the skull directly, which is either a convergent stroke of proto-medical genius or a convergent stroke of something else entirely. Possibly both. But here's the detail that actually stops you cold. Some of those skulls show bone regrowth around the edges of the hole. Smooth, rounded edges where the bone slowly healed back over weeks and months. That means the patient didn't die on the table. They woke up. They recovered enough for their body to start repairing the damage. And that means someone fed them, kept them warm, protected them while they were vulnerable and healing from a hole someone had put in their head with a stone tool. That's not nothing. That's actually a lot. Now, were they drilling holes because of mental illness specifically? Honestly, we don't know. The skulls can't tell us why, only that it happened and that the person survived. Some researchers think trepanation was for headaches or seizures or skull fractures from combat. Others think it was ritual. Others think the categories we're trying to apply, medical versus spiritual versus psychiatric, would have been completely meaningless to the people doing the drilling, because they didn't make those distinctions yet. Got bad headaches? Skull problem. Hearing voices? Skull problem. Acting strange and frightening your entire village? Skull problem. Drill. Done. The oldest surgical intervention we can document, and it predates every written language, every city, every civilization you learned about in school. Just a person, a stone tool, and someone who thought they could help. Now move east, roughly 1,000 miles, roughly 1,000 years later. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, which is modern Iraq, and a civilization that did something genuinely unexpected with mental illness. They wrote it down. Not casually, systematically. The Babylonians produced a text called the Diagnostic Handbook, the Sakiku, compiled around 1070 BC by a scholar-physician named Geel kin Apli. And it is exactly what it sounds like, a handbook for diagnosing illness, including mental illness, organized by symptom, by body part, by behavioral pattern. If a patient does this, the cause is probably this, and the treatment is this. Column after column, pressed into clay tablets in cuneiform script. This was not folk wisdom scratched on a cave wall. This was a professional medical document with a named author and an intended audience of trained specialists. Those specialists were called the Ashipu, priest healers, essentially. And the framework they operated within was what you might call the hand of a god doctrine. Your madness wasn't random. It wasn't bad luck. It was the hand of a specific god pressing down on you, for a specific reason, usually because of a specific transgression, something you did, or something your family did, that had now come due. The illness was a message. The Ashipu's job was to read it. Now that sounds like pure superstition, and in one sense it obviously is. But here's the thing. It also meant that mental illness had a cause. It wasn't meaningless chaos. It wasn't your fault in some vague, shameful way. It was a legible event in a moral universe, and legible events have responses. The Ashipu could intervene. He had tools, rituals, herbal treatments, incantations, dietary instructions. The system was wrong about the mechanism and surprisingly sophisticated about the structure. The clay tablets survive. You can hold a photograph of one and read, across 3,000 years, a Babylonian physician's careful notes on a patient who couldn't sleep, couldn't stop weeping, heard things that weren't there. Someone thought that was worth writing down. Egypt knew something the Babylonians didn't, or at least did something they didn't. And it's the thing I keep coming back to when I think about this whole history, because it's so disarmingly sensible that it almost feels like cheating. The temple complex at Dendera, dedicated to the goddess Hathor, functioned as something we'd now recognize as a treatment facility. Patients, people experiencing what we'd call mental illness, were brought there and housed. So far, standard ancient stuff. But the housing wasn't a cell. It wasn't a pit. The temples were built near the Nile, deliberately, for the sound and the air. There were gardens. There was music. Priests performed it as part of the therapeutic regimen. Patients were encouraged to engage in activities, to move, to be around other people, to participate in the rhythms of the place. This is called, in the modern clinical literature, environmental therapy, or milieu therapy, the idea that surroundings and daily structure actively shape mental states. It's considered a fairly progressive approach. The ancient Egyptians were doing a version of it roughly 2,000 years before European medicine would stumble back toward the same conclusion. Now, and this is the honest shrug part, we can't know for certain whether the Egyptians understood what they were doing in any theoretical sense, or whether they'd simply noticed, empirically, that people got better near the river with music and sunlight and something to do. The distinction between intentional therapeutic framework and accidentally humane practice is real, and the historical record doesn't settle it cleanly. But here's what the record does show. They kept doing it for centuries, which means it was working well enough that nobody stopped. The patients at Dendera weren't hidden. They weren't expelled from the community and left to wander. They were brought to one of the most architecturally significant religious sites in Egypt, housed within its walls and tended by its priests. Whether that was theology or medicine or both, and in ancient Egypt the categories were the same word, someone decided the suffering deserved the good place. Greece is where it gets loud, because Greece is where, for the first time in recorded history, people started publicly arguing about what mental illness actually was. And the argument was genuinely vicious, and both sides had a point, and neither side fully won, and we're still having a version of it right now. On one side, Hippocrates. Around 400 BC, he wrote that epilepsy, then called the sacred disease because of its apparent divine origin, was not sacred at all. It had a natural cause. It came from the brain. The brain was an organ. Organs malfunctioned. And when the brain malfunctioned, you got symptoms, including mental symptoms. No gods required. This was so radical a claim that Hippocrates felt he had to open the essay by directly attacking the people who disagreed with him, which tells you something about how the conversation was going. The position he was attacking was not just folk superstition, it was held by serious thinkers, including Plato, who argued that certain forms of madness were divine gifts. Prophetic madness, the kind that produced oracles, poetic madness, the kind that produced Homer, erotic madness, the kind that produced, well, most of human behavior throughout history. Plato called these the four divine madnesses, and his argument was that a person seized by prophetic frenzy was accessing something real, something beyond ordinary cognition, something the merely sane could never reach. And here's the uncomfortable part. He wasn't entirely wrong. The relationship between altered mental states and creativity, between what would now pathologize and what would celebrate, is not a settled question. It wasn't then. It isn't now. If this is the kind of thing that gets you, drop a like, leave a comment. It genuinely helps. Anyway. So you had Hippocrates saying, it's the brain, it's physical, treat it medically, a position so far ahead of its time that mainstream Western medicine wouldn't consistently return to it for roughly 2,000 years. And you had Plato saying some of this is divine, and you should be careful what you medicalize away. Two physicians, one city, completely incompatible frameworks, both still echoing. Rome inherited the Greek debate and did what Rome typically did with Greek ideas. Kept the parts that were useful, quietly dropped the parts that were inconvenient, and built excellent infrastructure around the remainder. Roman medicine largely followed Hippocrates. Roman law, however, went somewhere the Greeks hadn't quite gone, and that's where it gets genuinely dark. The legal category was called furiosus. A furiosus was a person deemed unable to manage their own affairs due to mental incapacity, and Roman law, to its credit, recognized that such a person needed protection. They couldn't be held to contracts. They couldn't be punished for crimes committed during an episode of madness. The law acknowledged explicitly that they weren't responsible in the way a sane person was responsible. For the 1st century BC, that's a fairly sophisticated position. But the protection came with a mechanism. A furiosus was assigned a curator, a legal guardian who managed their affairs, their property, their estate. And the curator was almost always a family member who stood to inherit. Sit with that for a second. The same legal instrument designed to shield a vulnerable person from exploitation was administered by the person with the most to gain from their incapacity. There was no independent oversight. There was no review process. If your family decided you were a furiosus, and a Roman magistrate agreed, your curator controlled everything you owned, and had every financial incentive to ensure the diagnosis remained in place. We don't have case files the way we'd have them now, but we have enough Roman legal writing, enough references in letters and histories, to know that the furiosus designation was used against people whose primary offense was being inconvenient heirs, or inconvenient spouses, or simply inconvenient. The machinery of care and the machinery of dispossession were, structurally, the same machine. They ran on the same paperwork. The law said, this person cannot be held responsible. The law also said, someone else now controls everything they have. Those two sentences were never in tension. That's the part that should bother you. While Europe was doing all of that, the furiosus paperwork, the inheritance maneuvering, the slow institutional drift toward treating the mentally ill as a legal problem to be managed, something genuinely different was happening in Baghdad. By the 9th century, the Abbasid Caliphate had built what we'd now recognize as dedicated psychiatric wards inside their general hospitals. The Bimaristan, the word means house of the sick in Persian, at Baghdad wasn't a dungeon. It had trained staff. It had separate sections for different conditions. It used treatments that included music, occupational activity, running water, and what the physicians there described as conversation intended to calm and reorient the patient. This predates the European moral therapy movement, which is usually credited to reformers in the late 1700s by nearly 1,000 years. The physician al-Razi, working in Baghdad in the 9th and 10th centuries, wrote about mental illness in explicitly medical terms, causes, symptoms, treatments, in a tradition that ran directly from Hippocrates through Islamic scholarship, while Europe had largely set those texts aside. The knowledge didn't disappear, it migrated. And then there's Geel. Geel is a small town in Belgium, and it has been doing something almost no other place in the world has consistently done since the 13th century. Housing mentally ill strangers in ordinary family homes. Not institutions, homes. The practice began as a religious pilgrimage tradition around the shrine of Saint Dymphna, patron saint of the mentally ill, and it simply never stopped. Families in Geel took in boarders, people experiencing what we'd now call schizophrenia, severe depression, psychosis, and those boarders lived as part of the household, ate at the table, worked in the fields or the shops, were known by name to the neighbors. 700 years. Meanwhile, Bedlam Royal Hospital in London, Bedlam, the word we still use, was charging admission fees for members of the public to come and observe the patients on Sundays. Bring the family. Point at the mad people. This was a popular leisure activity in 17th century London. Two approaches, same century, almost nothing in common. The famous image is Philippe Pinel, Paris 1793, striking the chains off patients at the Bicêtre Asylum. It's painted, literally there's a canvas of it, heroic composition, light falling dramatically on the liberated patients. The Enlightenment reformer arrives, the chains come off, progress happens. The painting is not wrong, exactly. Pinel did order the removal of chains. Patients were unchained. But the image flattens something important, which is that the knowledge Pinel was acting on, that humane treatment produced better outcomes than confinement and punishment, was not new. It had been demonstrated, repeatedly, by people who had been largely ignored. William Tuke, a Quaker merchant with no medical training, opened the York Retreat in England in 1796 after a Quaker woman died under suspicious circumstances at the local asylum. He ran it on the principle that patients responded to kindness, structure, and being treated as rational adults capable of self-governance. The outcomes were measurably better than the institutions around it. The medical establishment spent the next several decades arguing about whether a tea merchant had actually solved something they hadn't. He had. Moral therapy, the formal name for this approach, spread through the early 19th century and produced genuine improvements in recovery rates at the institutions that implemented it seriously. And then, within roughly 50 years, it was largely abandoned. Not because it stopped working, because the asylum population exploded, the institutions scaled up, and kindness doesn't scale the way a warehouse does. You can build a bigger building. You cannot easily build a bigger relationship between a staff member and a patient when the ratio is 1 to 100. The knowledge was there. The results were documented. The approach was quietly set aside anyway because the economics of care and the ethics of care have never naturally aligned, and the 19th century was not going to be the century that figured out how to make them. So the chains came back. Different chains, chemical, institutional, bureaucratic, but the underlying logic reasserted itself with remarkable speed. The gap between what we know works and what we actually do. It keeps showing up, every single era, without fail. So come back to the beginning, back to that person in the dark, hearing voices. Not in ancient Egypt this time, not in Mesopotamia, not in Rome, not in a Restoration-era asylum with Sunday visitors paying a penny to stare. Right now, tonight. 3 in the morning and the voices are there and you don't know what's happening to you, and the question of what comes next depends, as it has always depended, across every civilization we've looked at, not just on what medicine knows, but on what the people around you believe you deserve. That's the thread that runs through all of it, not knowledge, belief. The Babylonians had a framework that was wrong about causes and surprisingly structured about care. The Egyptians put suffering people in beautiful places near running water and didn't fully know why it helped. The Greeks argued in public about whether madness was a disease or a gift, and neither side completely won. Rome built legal protections that doubled as legal weapons. Islamic physicians preserved and extended a medical tradition, while European institutions were charging admission. A town in Belgium decided, sometime in the 13th century, that the right response to a stranger in distress was to bring them home, and has kept doing it for 700 years, which is so far outside the norm of human institutional behavior that I genuinely don't know what to do with it except point at it and say, that happened, and it works, and almost nobody copied it. And then the Enlightenment arrived with its reforms and its heroic paintings and its documented evidence that kindness produced better outcomes. And within 2 generations, the economics won anyway. What we know has never been the limiting factor. We have known in various forms and frameworks for most of recorded history that the person hearing voices is suffering, that the suffering has causes, and that how you respond to it matters. The trepan skulls with healed edges knew it. The priests at Dendera knew it. William Tuke, the tea merchant, knew it. The question every era faces, and that you're facing right now, living inside a mental health system that knows more than it has ever known and still cannot close the gap between knowledge and care, isn't what do we understand. It's what do we believe the suffering deserve, and what we're willing to pay for that belief. That question doesn't belong to ancient history. It belongs to right now. It belongs to you.